If you're an aspiring web designer and you want to learn how to breathe life into your designs using CSS colors and backgrounds, then start here. In this course, we're going to take the layout that we finished in the last course and we're going to give it some personality by turning it into this. In this course, you're going to start by learning how to add background colors, and in the process, you're going to learn about some of the different types of colors that you can work with in CSS. From there, you're going to learn about how to set text colors on headings and regular text and also on links. You'll learn how to insert and control background images. You'll learn how to work with border colors, and you'll also learn how to add some cool effects using CSS3 shadows. By the end of this course, you'll have completed the site that you've been working on since the beginning of the Start Here series, and you'll also have all the most important information on how to work with colors and backgrounds in CSS. So let's go ahead and jump in to Start Here, learn CSS colors and backgrounds. I'll see you in the first lesson. Hi, welcome to Start Here, learn CSS colors and backgrounds. This is the final course in our Start Here, learn web design series. In this course, we're going to take the site that you've been working on throughout the duration of this series, and it currently looks like this, and we're going to add CSS colors and backgrounds, and we're going to turn it into this. Now, the first place that we're going to start is with CSS background colors. But before we get into adding background colors into our design, let's quickly go over the basics of how background colors work, and also the different types of colors that you can use in CSS. Alright, so what we have here is just a basic HTML page. We've got two divs. We've got a div with the class parent, and inside that we've got a div with the class child. And you can see their layout when we hover over the parent element in Chrome Web Developer Tools Inspector. Now, right now you can't see those divs because they have no color. So over in our CSS, we're going to add some background colors to each of these divs. Now, to add background color, the property that you want to use is background-color. Now, as for values, when you're working with color in CSS, there are a few different types of colors that you can use. And in this course, we're going to look at 3 of those types. We'll look at CSS color names, we'll look at hex codes, and we'll also look at RGBA colors. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is CSS color names. Now, these are words that represent specific colors. Below this video, you should find a link to this page here, which gives you a list of all the different CSS color names that are available to you. So let's have a quick look through and we'll pick out a couple of these colors. Let's try antique white. So we'll just copy and paste that and use that as the value for our background color on our parent class. And let's try aquamarine. As our value for the child class. We'll bring up our page, save our CSS. And there you can see we've got our antique white background color on the parent and our aquamarine background color on the child. So that's the first type of color value you can use when you're working with color in CSS. The second type that we're going to look at is called hex codes. Now, hex represents 6. So what hex code means is a code that has 6 places in it. Now, I'll give you an example of a hex code. Hex codes always start with the hash symbol, and then after that you have your 6 characters. Each character can be a number, 0 through 9, or a letter, A through F. So we're just going to put in 6 zeros. Then we'll save, and there you can see that our hex code has given us the color black. Now, the way that hex codes work is the first 2 characters represent the color red. And the characters that you use in these 2 places determine how much red is going to be in your color. Now, we've set this to 0, and that means there will be no red in the color. The second 2 characters represent the color green. And once again, by setting these characters to 0, we're saying there's going to be no green in this color either. And then finally, the last 2 characters represent blue. And once more, we're setting this to 0, 0, saying there's going to be no blue in the color either. Now, you probably will have noticed that those 3 colors that are represented here are RGB. So what you're doing with the hex code is specifying an RGB color value. Now, on one end of the scale, you can set the characters 0, 0 to say you don't want any red or any green or any blue in your color. On the other end of the scale, the highest end of the scale, you can use the letter F. And when you use the letter F, you're setting the maximum amount of red, green, or blue into your color. So now let's do that on our child class. So for red, we're going to use FF to set it to the maximum. For green, we'll use FF again, setting that to the maximum. And then for blue, we'll also set FF to set that to the maximum. And we'll save. And now that's set the background color of our child element to white. So these two hex codes are at either end of the color spectrum. When you turn everything down to 0, you get black. And when you turn everything up to F, the highest value, you get white. And to create colors in between, you mix up these values. So for example, let's say we want to make the brightest red possible. We know that these first two characters represent red. So we're going to leave those at FF, dialed up to the highest point. But for the last characters, we want to have no green in the color, so we'll set that to 0. And we also want to have no blue in the color, so we'll set that to 0. And then that gives us red. We can do the same thing if we want to create a bright blue. We don't want any red in the color, so our first two characters will be 0, 0. We don't want any green, so again, 0, 0. But we do want the brightest possible blue, so we'll set that to FF. And there we have blue. So from here, we can start mixing things up. So let's say you want to create magenta. Now, in the RGB color space, if you mix red and blue, you get magenta. So we'll change our first two characters to FF so that we add red. We'll leave our second two characters at 0, 0, so we have no green. And then we'll add blue by setting the last two characters to FF. Now we'll save, and there's our magenta. Now, as you can see, this is fairly lurid right now because everything is dialed up to the maximum. So let's say we want to have a red color, but we don't want it to be quite so bright. Now, the hex code that we used to create red before was FF0000. Now, if we want to make that a little softer, what we can do is choose one of the values that's somewhere in between 0, the lowest, and F, which is the highest. Now, these values count up from 0. So they go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then instead of counting out 10, 11, 12, and so on, we use letters instead. So once we get to 9, we move on to A, B, C, D, E, F. So let's insert AA instead. There, now we've got a red, but it's much darker than what we had before. Now let's make it even darker again by using some numbers. Now let's use 6, 6. So now the red has darkened off even further. So you can mix these letter and number characters up in any way that you want to create all sorts of different colors. Now if we go over to the color name list that we were looking at before, then you can see the corresponding hex codes that match the color names we used earlier. So we can get the antique white color back again, and we'll put that onto our parent. We'll put the aquamarine color onto our child. And now we get the same colors that we had just a moment ago, but instead of using color names, we're now using hex codes. So by using all of these different letter and number values and mixing together different amounts of red, green, and blue, you can create all kinds of different colors. And that brings us to the third type of color that we're going to look at, and that is RGBA colors. And you've already seen how you can use RGB to create different colors. And with RGBA, you add an extra value, and that is alpha. Now what alpha does is allows you to add transparency to a color, so an alpha value. Now let's look at an example. So we're just going to delete these two colors. And instead we're going to add in RGBA, and then we're going to add a set of brackets. Now we're going to add values for R, G, and B, similarly to what we just did with our hex codes, only this time we're going to use comma-separated numbers. And the first three of these numbers represent our RGB values. And they can be set anywhere from 0, which is the lowest, up to 255, which is the highest, and is the equivalent to FF in a hex code. Now first we'll add a value for R, which is red, and we'll set that to 0. And we'll add a comma. Now we'll add a value for G, which is green. We'll set that to 0. Then we'll add a value for B, which is blue, and we'll set that to 0 as well. Now we need to add a value for A, which is the alpha value, and this determines how see-through the color is. Now if we don't want it to be see-through at all, then we'll add 1 as the value, which is the highest possible alpha value. And we'll save. Now both of our divs have been set to black. Now this is just like the hex code that we created earlier where we had 6 zeros. We've said that there should be no red, green, or blue in our color, which just leaves us with black. But now what we can do with our fourth value here is we can change the opacity. 1 is the highest, which means that this is not see-through at all. If we change it to 0, it'll be completely see-through. So if we change it to 0.5, it's going to be halfway in between the two. Now let's see what the effect is. So now what we've got is a black color with 50% opacity. So our parent div here is allowing the white color of the background to show through, which is why it comes up looking a little bit gray. But our child div here is letting both the white of the background and the color of the parent div show through as well, which is making it look darker. Now, RGBA colors can be very useful for when you want to do things like creating shadow effects that will let background images show through, and for giving you different sorts of subtle ways to blend colors together. And you'll see that in action a little bit later in the course. Alright, so that covers the essentials of CSS color names, hex codes, and RGBA colors. Let's take that and use it to apply some background colors to our design. Okay, so here we are at the site that we've been working on throughout the duration of this series. And in the source files that come with this course, you'll also find a set of starter files that will let you just pick up where you need to carry on with this course. So open up a preview of that site from the starter files and the style CSS file. And we're going to add 3 background colors. We're going to add a background color to our body so that everything in our whole site is colored. We're going to add a background color to our wrapper so that our main content area here is colored. And then we're also going to add a background color to fill in our image frame here. All right, so let's start with our body color. So in the body style, add the property background-color. And we're going to use a hex code, and we're going to set it to 75A1A0, and then end the line with a semicolon. All right, so now that has put a background color across our whole site. Now we're going to color our wrapper here. So we'll find our wrapper class, add the background color property again. This time our hex code is going to be CEC9B6. So now we've got a color to our wrapper, and you can see that the background and foreground colors that we have here match and work in with the logo that we already have set in our design. Now finally, we're going to add a background color into our image frame. So we'll find our image frame class, add the background color property again, and now we'll add the hex code 443D3B. All right, and then that gives us a brown that matches the brown from our logo. So now we have all of our background colors in place, and we're ready to continue laying more color and polish onto our site. So in the next lesson, we're going to move on to setting text and link colors. Now right now, we've still just got our default black text in place, and we're going to change that to suit something a little bit more in keeping with our color scheme. And we've also just got default link colors here, so we're going to change that to suit our color scheme too. And you'll learn how to do all that in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hi, welcome back to Start Here, Learn CSS Colors and Backgrounds. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to apply colors to your text and to your links. So what we've got to work with here is we have an H1 heading. We have some regular text in paragraphs here. We also have an H3 heading down here. Now what you could do if you wanted is set a color to specifically target the H1 element and the H3 element. However, in our design, we're going to have the headings and the text all the same color, so we're not going to need to set separate colors for our headings. I just wanted to make sure that you're aware that you can do that if you want to. But in the case of our site, what we're going to do is just set a site-wide text color, and we're going to do that by targeting the body element. So any unlinked text that is inside our body element, including paragraph text and headings, will be affected. Now the property to use when you are creating text color is just color. So we'll add that in, and then we're going to set the default text color for our whole site with the hex code 3A, 3F, 3F. All right, so now the color is applied to our main H1 heading, to our regular text, and to our H3 heading. But you'll notice that it hasn't affected our links. And that's because we need to add in some link-specific code. So you remember from our previous lessons on HTML that the element that controls a link is the A element. So that's the element that we're going to target. So we'll add in an A selector to our CSS. And now we'll set the color for that to the hex code 864200. All right, and there we go. That's changed our link color to a nice soft and bright brown. and that brings it into keeping with all the rest of our colors. But we're also going to add in a couple of little extras to our link color. So right now, nothing happens when you hover over the link. You do get the regular little hand sign that you're used to seeing when you hover over links, but nothing else happens. So what we're going to do is make the link change color when we hover over it. And the way that we do that is by adding a new style, still using our AE selector. But this time, we're going to add :hover. And this is going to let us set a color that will only appear when a person is hovering over this link. So we'll add in our color property again. And this time we use the hex code 34918F. And now when we hover over, we can see the color change in our link. And there are a couple of other states that we can also target in a similar way to what we just did with the hover state. We can also target the active state for a link that a person has already been to, and the link state, which is another way of targeting the default link color. And we're going to use a comma-separated list to make our first color apply to the link states and visited states. So we're going to include A:link for the link state and A:visited to color the visited state. And then we're going to apply our hover color also to the active state. Now you can color these different states however you like. Here we're just applying the colors that we're already using just to keep things a little bit simpler, but feel free to experiment with those. So now we have our headings, our regular text, and our link colors, including hover colors. However, our footer text down the bottom here is still just taking the same color as the rest of our site, which doesn't really fit. So outside of our wrapper area, you'll recall that we have two elements. We have our footer element here, and we have our header element up here. So we're going to create some styling that's going to control the color in both of those elements. So we'll add header, footer. We'll add a color property, and then we're going to set the hex code as 165A58. All right, so that's changed our color here to a green that matches the background that we have it over. Now there's one important thing that you have to be aware of when you're setting the colors in your text for your sites, and that is what we call accessibility. Accessibility is thinking about people who may have vision impairment or other sorts of reading difficulty that make it difficult for them to access your website. And one aspect of accessibility is ensuring that you have good color contrast. So for example, if you have a light background, you have to make sure that your text color is dark enough that it contrasts with the background sufficiently to be readable. So when you're setting all of your color codes, what you should do is run a little accessibility auditing plugin. This works with Chrome Web Developer Tools, and I'll include a link to where you can get that plugin in the notes below this video. So let's see how this audit works. So I'm going to open up Chrome Web Developer Tools, and I'm going to choose the Audits tab on the very far right-hand side here. And then I'm going to press the Run button. And you see here that we have a warning. And if we expand that out, it's telling us that the color that we've applied to our header and footer, we'll just have a look at that color again, that it doesn't have enough of a contrast ratio. So that's letting us know that right now this color is not accessible enough. So what we can do is inspect that color, and we'll just have a look at the window here. And then you just want to click into the tab named Accessibility Properties. So we have our paragraph highlighted here, and then down here you'll see it's suggesting some different colors that we can use. And it's telling us that in order for our text here to have enough of a contrast ratio, that we should instead use the hex code 003837. So let's copy that code and add it into our CSS. Now we'll refresh. We'll open up our audits again. Click back up into this audit section here on the left. Click Run one more time. And now you can see that we're passing all of the tests. We don't have any warnings. Everything is green lit. So that tells us that the color that we've inserted has made this text properly accessible. So now we have got our background colors in. We've got our heading colors, our text color, and our link colors. And everything has a contrast ratio that allows it to be fully accessible. And right now we just have flat background colors. But in the next lesson, we're going to add a little texture. We're going to do that by adding background images. We're going to add a background image in our main body area, and we're also going to add a background image to our wrapper. And you'll learn how to do that in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hi, and welcome back to Start Here, Learn CSS Colors and Backgrounds. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to work with background images in CSS. So what we've got here is just a basic HTML page once again. This time we don't have any HTML inside the body because we're just going to be styling the body element directly. Now these are the files that we're working with. So we've got the HTML and the CSS file that we are using. And then inside the same folder, we have another folder named images. And inside that, we have a background image. And we're going to use this background image inside our body element. Now, the way that we do that is with the property background-image. Now, in order to place the image, we then need to add URL followed by a pair of brackets, and then we'll add a semicolon. And then in between the brackets, we need to add some talking marks. And then in between those talking marks, we can put the location of our images. And as we saw, that's inside the images folder. And then we're going to put the name of the image, which is bg_1.jpg. Now we'll save that. And now as you can see, our background image has filled up our entire body element. Now the background image itself is only about this wide and about this high. But by default, any background image that you place is going to repeat itself horizontally and vertically. Now, if you want to change the way that a background image is repeating, then you can use the property background-repeat. Now let's say we don't want this background image to repeat at all. We just want to place it once. In that case, we'll set this value as no-repeat. Alright, so there is our background image. It's just in there one time only. Now what if we want to repeat it horizontally? Now in two-dimensional design, the horizontal axis is also referred to as the x-axis. So if we want something to repeat horizontally, we want it to repeat on the x-axis. So in that case, we'll set this value to be repeat-x. And there we go, now that's horizontally tiling. And if you want to tile it vertically, that's called the y-axis. So then we can just change it from repeat x to repeat y. And now the image is repeating itself horizontally only. And then if you want to explicitly state that it needs to tile in both directions, then you just use the value repeat with nothing else attached to it. Now, the third property you'll most commonly work with when dealing with background images is background position. Now I'm just going to change the value of background repeat to no repeat again. Now we'll add in our background position property. Now, by default, our image has positioned itself on the left side at the top of the screen, but we can change that if we want to. The background position property takes two values. The first one is the position that the image should take on the x-axis, and you remember that's the horizontal axis. The second one is the position the image should take on the y-axis, and that's vertical. So let's say that on the x-axis, horizontally, we want it to be on the right side instead of the left. Then we'll enter right. And on the y-axis, the vertical, let's say that we want it to be in the bottom instead of on the top. Then we'll set the second property after a space to bottom. And now before we save that, we're also just going to add in HTML, body, and we're going to give our HTML and body elements some height to make sure that they take up the full window. All right, now we'll save that. And as you can see, our background image has moved itself down to the bottom right corner. Now this first value for the x-axis can be set to either left, center, or right. The second value for the y-axis can be set to either top, center, or bottom. So if you want to position a background image right in the middle of an element, then you can just set both of these to center. All right, so that covers all the essentials of working with background images. Now let's go ahead and add some background images into the design we're working on. Okay, so here we are back in our site. The first thing that we're going to do is add a background image to our body. So just like we just did, we'll add the property background-image. Then we'll add URL with a pair of brackets, and we'll end that with a semicolon. Add talking marks, and then provide the location of the image in between the talking marks. And that's images/bg_1.jpg. And we're not specifying the background repeat property here, and that just means that it will automatically tile in both directions on the X and Y axis. So we'll save that. And there we go. Now we can see that our background image, just expand this so you can see it, is now tiling all around the body. So you can see that coming up around the edges and all the way down to the bottom of the screen. So now let's do the same thing with our wrapper. Scroll this down a little bit. Find our wrapper class. Now once again, we'll add background-image URL with a pair of brackets, talking marks in between, and then we'll provide the location of our image, which is images/bg_2.jpg. And once again, we're just going to leave this with its default behavior of repeating in both directions. And there we go. Now we can see that we've got some texture added in to the wrapper section. So now we've got our background colors added in. We've got our text and our link colors added. We've added our background images, and we're almost done with coloring our site. We've just got a couple of little extra things that we're going to do to finish up with the polishing process. Right now, we've still got default colors on our borders. So in the next lesson, we're going to go through working with border colors. I'll see you there. Hi, and welcome back to Start Here, Learn CSS Colors and Backgrounds. In this lesson, we're going to go through and change the colors of our borders. Then once we've done that, I'm also going to show you how to compress all the border properties that you've added so far into a single line to make borders a little bit easier for you to work with from here on. So we have two borders. We have one around our wrapper, and then we have another around our image frame. So let's start by changing the wrapper border color. Now you can probably guess what the property is going to be for this. Inside our wrapper class, we'll add border-color. And we're going to set that to the hex code D8D4C3. All right, so now that has turned our border here into a nice subtle sandy yellow. Now let's do the same thing down here with our image frame border color. So we'll find our image frame class, and we'll add the property border color, and we'll add the hex code D8D4C3. And there you go. Now, just like with our wrapper, we've got a nice soft sandy colored border around our image frame. Now we'll scroll back up to our wrapper class. And right now we've got three different properties controlling our border. We have border width, border style, and border color. But you can actually set all three of these in a single line. So instead, you can just use the property border, and then you can put all of the values that you've used for each of those three properties as a value in this line. All you need to do is separate them by a space. So we'll grab our width property, we'll copy and paste that, we'll make a space, our border style property, and finally our border color property. Now we can delete all three of those lines. I'll scroll up here so we can see the wrapper border. Now if we save, you'll see absolutely nothing has changed, and that's because this shorthand is the equivalent to what we wrote before in three separate lines. So just get rid of these empty spaces, and now let's go and do the same thing with our image frame. So we'll add the border property. We'll add in our border width, our border style, and our border color. And then we can delete these other lines. And when we save, we see that nothing changes. So that's the quick and easy way to set up your borders all in one line. And the only thing that you have to remember is that the order those properties go in is width, style, color. All right, so we're almost there. Our colors and backgrounds are nearly done. We're just going to do one more thing, and that is adding some cool shadow effects. First to our main headings, our H1 and H3 elements, and then we're also going to add a cool drop-down shadow to our wrapper element, and we're going to do that using CSS3 shadows. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Hi, and welcome to the final lesson of Start Here, Learn CSS Colors and Backgrounds. In this lesson, we're going to use some CSS3 shadow effects to add a little bit of extra dimension and a little bit of extra polish to our coloring process. And there have been a few different versions of CSS. We started with CSS1, we went through CSS2. Right now we're in the middle of CSS3, which is almost fully supported across all popular browsers. And we're starting to see what's going to be coming next in CSS4. Now, CSS3 brought in some extra cool things that you can do that previously you needed to work with flat images for. And one of those things is drop-down shadows. Now, there's two types of shadows that we're going to be working with in this video. The first is a box shadow, and the second is a text shadow. A text shadow can be put on any text, as the name suggests, and a box shadow is designed for using on square elements like divs. So we're going to start by putting a box shadow on our wrapper element. So we'll add in the property box-shadow. Now there are a few values that you need to put into your box shadow property. And the first two let you define the offset of the shadow that you're creating. The first value is the X offset, which is on the horizontal axis. The second value is the Y offset, which is on the vertical axis. And you'll see what we mean by offset once the shadow's in place in a little bit. So for both of these values, we're going to enter 0.625 rem. Now here you also have the option to add a value for blur and spread. Blur is how softened you want your shadow to be, and spread controls the overall size of your shadow. Now we're not going to be using those properties for our purposes, but I'll include a link below where you can read a little bit more about them. But because we're not going to be using those properties, we can skip to the last property, and that is the color of the shadow. Now here, we're going to be using an RGBA value. And you'll remember from our first video in this course, we talked about how RGBA color values allow you to create see-through colors. And that's perfect for our shadow because we'll be able to have a shadow coming off our wrapper with the background image showing through it. So we'll add RGBA with a set of brackets, and we'll just add a semicolon to close off our line. And now for the color, we're going to add 58 for the red value, 89 for the green value, 87 for the blue value, and 0.5 for the alpha value. Now we'll save that, and we'll expand our window so you can see the shadow. And there we go. Now we have a shadow running down the right side of our wrapper. Now if you look closely, you'll see that the image is showing through that shadow. And then we also have the same shadow running along the bottom. So the way the shadow is generated is a box the same size as the element we've applied it to, in this case our wrapper element, is generated, then it's offset by the amount that we specify in the first two values of our shadow. So that's what we mean when we refer to offset. The shadow is created and then it's just moved or offset. Then it's given the color that we've specified in the last value of our shadow. So that just gives us a little bit of something extra to help add dimension and style to the site. Now we're going to do the same thing to our headings here. And this time we're going to use the text shadow property. All right, so for this one, we're going to create a new class and we're going to call it heading_shadow. Now before we move on, we're just going to add this class to our two headings. So in the HTML, for our H1 here, we're going to add class equals heading_shadow. And then we'll do the same thing in the heading for our sidebar. Now back in our CSS, we'll add the property text-shadow. Now what we're going to do with this effect is we're actually going to create two shadows and have them stacked one on top of the other. And that's one of the cool things that you can do with CSS shadows. You can actually have as many shadows as you want. All you need to do is create a list of values just like we did here with our box shadow, then add a comma, and then after that you can add another list of values just the same. And what you'll end up with is a number of shadows stacked one on top of the other. And you can create a lot of really cool visual effects with this. So what we're going to do is to create a subtle dark colored shadow underneath our text, but on top of that we're going to have another shadow that's about the same color as the background. And that's going to make it look like there's a gap in between the letters and the shadow that's underneath them. So let's go ahead and set that up. First we'll put in our darkly colored shadow. So we're going to set the X offset for this shadow to 0.125 rem. We're also going to set the Y offset to the same amount. And we're going to set the color with the X code ABA076. And we'll save that. So then now you can see we've had our shadow come up on our heading text. It's a version of the color of our background, but it's a little darker to try and make it look like a natural shadow. Now we're going to stack a shadow on top of that. When you're creating multiple shadows, whichever one you put first in your list is going to come up on top. Now we want to add a shadow that's going to come up on top of the one that we've already added. So we're going to put this in front of the shadow that we've already created. So we'll just add a comma before this and a space. And then before the comma, we're going to add in our new shadow. Now this one is going to have a smaller offset. So for both the X and Y offsets, we'll put 0.0625 rem. And for the color, we'll use the hex code D0CBB8. And now we'll save that. And now when you look at the shadow, you can see that that's changed the effect. We've put a smaller shadow on top of the one we'd already created, and that shadow is about the same color as the background. And because we've put that shadow first, it partially obscures the shadow that's behind it. And now the same shadow effect is also applied to the sidebar heading. All right, so that's it. You've now completed the coloring of your website. You've added in background colors and background images. You've set the text coloring and the link coloring for your site, and you've made sure that it's all accessible. You've set up all your border colors, and you've created some nice shadow effects to go along with it all. So that wraps up the final lesson for this course. I hope you'll join me in the last video where we recap what we've done in this course, as well as everything that you've learnt through the entire Start Here series. And then I'll give you some tips on where you can go next as you continue learning web design. So I'll see you in the final video. Congratulations, you just finished Start Here, Learn CSS Colors and Backgrounds. So you started with a purely monochrome website, your layout was finished but you had nothing else. So you added in background colors, and while you were doing that, you learned about the different types of colors that you can use. You learned about hex codes, RGBA values, and color names. You set the colors for your text and for your links, and you learned about link states, as well as how to make sure that the colors that you choose have sufficient contrast to ensure that your sites are accessible. You then added background images, and you learned about positioning and repeating of background images. You then set up the colors of your borders, you learned how to compress your border settings into a single line of shorthanded code, and then you learned how to add shadow effects using CSS3 shadows. So that's a lot of really important fundamentals that you've just learned how to do, and you're going to be taking these things that you've just learned with you throughout your entire web design career. So you should feel really proud of yourself for learning everything that you have in such a short space of time. And the same thing goes for everything that you've learned how to do since the beginning of this Start Here series. When you began, we went right through the absolute essentials of how to create HTML elements, and then you learned all about typography, you learned all about layout, including how to make your sites responsive, and then you've just added in the final layer of polish, which is your coloring. Now, obviously, as you go through web design, you can get into huge amounts of complexity in your designs, but what you've learned in this series is the most critical and important fundamentals that will be in everything that you do. And even though there are a lot of extras that you can get into, with what you've learnt in this course, there's a virtually infinite amount of design that you can create just using these critical essentials. So where should you go from here? Well, what I recommend is, rather than branching off into anything more complex right away, is just practicing and practicing with what you've learnt in this series and just becoming really solid with those basics. So go through the process of creating a few more websites using the exact same steps that we did with what we've got here. So set up your basic HTML, then set up your typography, then add in your layout, and then add your color scheme. And when you've done that 3 or 4 times, you should be able to get some really nice designs together, and you'll make sure that you really solidify those fundamentals. From there, I recommend reading up on SEO, search engine optimization, which is one of the most important skills that a web designer can have. I also recommend looking further into accessibility, because there are a lot of things that you can do that are not very difficult to add into your site that make sure that all of your designs are accessible for everybody. And then I also recommend having a further read into CSS3 and learning about some of the extra design tools that it puts at your disposal. And as always, we have a ton of really great resources over at Tuts Plus on all of the aforementioned topics. So I hope that you've really enjoyed both this course and the entire Start Here series, and that you're feeling confident and excited to keep moving on with learning web design. So thanks again for taking this course and for taking the entire Start Here series. And I'll see you in the next one.